The judge did not even wait for me to sit down. "Ma'am, whatever that is on your chest, take it off." The courtroom had that early morning smell to it, floor wax and burnt coffee and the wet wool of people who had walked in from the rain. 40 people, maybe 50. My sister-in-law sat one table over with her hands folded like a woman at church, and when the judge said those words, she turned her head just enough for me to catch the corner of her smile. I stood there in my service dress. Blue coat, white cover under my arm, and above my left breast pocket, the ribbon and the cross I have worn exactly 4 times in my life. I could feel the whole room looking at it, not at me, at it. My name is Nora Vance. I gave the Marine Corps 22 years, and I never once used any of it to get a better table at a restaurant. But on a wet Tuesday morning in Barrow County, in a courtroom with a broken clock over the door, a man in a black robe decided that the hardest thing I ever did in my life was a piece of costume jewelry. He was wrong about a lot of things that morning. That was only the first one. Let me back up, because a story like this never starts where it looks like it starts. I grew up 2 blocks off Delroy Street in a town small enough that the pharmacist knew what your mother took for her blood pressure. My father, Walt Vance, ran a machine shop there for 31 years. Vance Machine and Tool. Green sign, hand-painted, the letters slightly crooked because he refused to pay a sign man to do what he could do himself with a level and a bad attitude. I spent my childhood on the floor of that shop, sweeping metal shavings into a dustpan for a quarter an hour. I learned to read a caliper before I learned to drive. My brother Grant learned the same things, only he hated every minute of it and I loved it, which tells you most of what you need to know about how the two of us turned out. I joined the Marine Corps at 22, not because of any speech or any flag on a football field. I joined because I sat in a college advising office one afternoon and realized I could not name a single thing I had ever done that scared me, and that seemed like a bad way to be 22. I stayed for 22 more years. Most of it is ordinary. People do not understand that. They picture the whole thing as fire and noise, and the truth is that a career is mostly paperwork, mostly waiting, mostly standing in a hangar at 2 in the morning while somebody looks for a part. The fire and the noise take up about 9 minutes total, and you spend the rest of your life carrying those 9 minutes around in a bag you never put down. Mine happened when I was a captain. I will not narrate it here the way people want it narrated, with the music swelling. What I will say is that a vehicle went into a canal, and there was a corpsman named Beckett who could not swim as well as he had claimed on a form somewhere, and I went in after him. And then I went back in a second time for a lance corporal, whose name I still say out loud on the 11th of April every year. The Navy Cross came about 14 months later, in a ceremony I remember mostly as being too hot. There is a photograph of it somewhere. In the photograph I look like a woman waiting for a bus. I never talked about it. Not at holidays, not at cookouts, not when the man at the tire shop saw my plates and asked if I had seen any action. My mother told the whole quilting circle, and I asked her twice to stop, and she never did, and I forgave her for it because that is what mothers are for. The medal lived in a drawer in a wooden box my father made out of walnut scrap. That is where it lived for years. In a drawer, under a stack of tax returns. My mother Ruth got sick in the spring 3 years ago. Pancreas. If you have been near that particular word, you already know the shape of what came next, and if you have not, I would not wish the education on you. I was 6 months out from retirement. I put in my papers early and came home. Grant lived 40 minutes away and had 2 teenagers and a job that ran him ragged, so the day-to-day fell to me, and I want to be honest here, because I have heard the version of this story that other people tell. I did not do it out of saintliness. I did it because I had spent 22 years being the person who handles things, and I did not know how to be anything else in a room where something was going wrong. For 11 months, I slept in my childhood bedroom with the door open so I could hear her. I learned the schedule of the hospice nurses. I learned how to crush a pill into applesauce. I learned that the person you have known your whole life will, at some point, look at you and ask when her mother is coming to pick her up, and you will have to decide in about half a second whether to tell her the truth. In September of that year, when she was still sharp most days, my mother had her attorney draw up a durable power of attorney naming me. She did it at her own kitchen table with the attorney and a witness from the bank present. Grant knew. I called him that same night. He said, "Thank God it's you and not me," and he meant it kindly. She also, and this matters, kept the shop. My father had died 4 years before her. The shop had gone quiet after that. Nobody wanted a small job shop with an old Bridgeport and a lathe older than I am. Ruth would not sell it. She paid the property taxes out of her Social Security, and she kept the electricity on, and once a month she had me drive her down there so she could sit in the office and look at the calendar my father never took down, the one still turned to the month he died. I asked her once why she was paying to keep a building nobody used. She said, "Because your father is still in it. That is the whole reason. There is no better one." When she died, I went through her papers and found the tax receipts in a shoebox, every one of them, going back 4 years, paper-clipped by year. Now, Tessa. Tessa married my brother 11 years ago. She is not a monster. I want to be careful about that because it is easy to tell this story with horns and a tail, and the real thing is smaller and more common and honestly a lot sadder. Tessa grew up with nothing and married into a family that had a little something, and she never stopped counting it. That is the best way I can put it. At every gathering there was a moment where you could see her doing arithmetic behind her eyes. Whose ring? Whose car? Who got the good chair? She was pleasant to me for about 6 years. Then my father died, and the will read simply, "And everything went to Ruth," and I watched Tessa's face go flat in a way I have only otherwise seen on people who have just found out a flight is canceled. She started with small things. She would call Grant on speakerphone while I was in the room and say things she wanted me to hear. She began referring to my mother's house as the property, not the house, the property. When Ruth got sick, Tessa came around exactly 3 times in 11 months. I am not saying that to be cruel. I am saying it because it becomes important later, when a woman who visited a dying person 3 times stood up in a courtroom and explained to a judge what that dying person had really wanted. There was one visit in particular. February. My mother was down to about 90 pounds and slept most of the afternoon. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand and said, "We all just want to make sure everything's taken care of, Ruth." And my mother, who was tired but not gone, said, "Nora's got it." Tessa looked at me over her shoulder when she said it. I did not say anything. I went and made coffee. I have thought about that 800 times since, and I still do not know if saying something would have changed one single thing. My mother died on a Thursday in April at 4:40 in the afternoon, with the window open because she wanted to hear the yard. The will was not complicated. The house to be sold and split evenly between Grant and me. Her savings split evenly. The shop on Delroy Street to me, specifically and by name, with a line in her own words that the attorney had put in at her insistence. It said, "To my daughter Nora," who knows what it is. The estate came to a little under $300,000 all in, most of it the house. The shop was appraised at $51,000, which tells you what kind of building we are talking about. It is a cinder block box with a bad roof. 6 weeks after the funeral, I got a letter from a law office in the county seat. Tessa was not named in the will, so the suit came through Grant, which is a sentence I still have trouble saying out loud. The petition alleged that I had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable adult, that I had isolated my mother during her final year, that I had used the power of attorney to move money for my own benefit. It asked the court to void the provision leaving me the shop. And it asked for an accounting, and it asked that I be removed as executor. There was a specific number in there, $41,000. That was the amount they claimed I had taken. I want to tell you what that $41,000 was, because it is the joke at the center of this whole thing. It was $22,000 for 11 months of in-home hospice care that Medicare did not cover. It was $9,000 and change for the funeral, which my mother had picked out herself, including the casket, from a catalog on an afternoon when she was in a good enough mood to make fun of the prices. It was $6,000 for a headstone for both of my parents, because my father had gone 4 years without one, and she could not stand it anymore. It was $3,100 to a roofer for the shop, because the flat roof failed in November and water was coming in over the electrical panel, and my mother told me on the phone, from her bed, to call Dale Rusk and get it fixed, and not to argue with him about the price. The rest was property taxes, an ambulance ride, and a bill from a pharmacy. Every single dollar had a receipt. Every single one. Because when you spend 22 years in an organization where somebody eventually asks you to account for a missing radio battery, you develop certain habits, and one of mine is that I do not throw away paper. I called Grant the night I got served. He answered on the 6th ring, which told me plenty. He said, "Nora, it's not what you think." I said, "Tell me what it is then." He said, "Tessa just thinks there should be a look at it. That's all. Just an independent look." I asked him if he had read the petition. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear a television going in the background in his house. He said, "I skimmed it." I said, "Grant, it says I isolated her." He said, "That's just how lawyers write." I hung up on my brother for the first time in 46 years. I sat on the back steps for a while afterward. It had gotten warm. The neighbor's kid was practicing something on a trumpet through an open window and doing an honestly criminal job of it, and I remember laughing and then not laughing, and that is the closest I came to falling apart in the whole thing. I hired a lawyer named Priya Raman out of an office above a hearing aid store in the county seat. She was 34, and she talked fast, and she was the third attorney I met with and the only one who did not tell me to settle. The first thing she did was ask for the shoebox. The second thing she did, after she had spent a weekend with it, was call me at 7 in the morning and say, "Nora, they have nothing. This is not a case. This is a pressure campaign with a filing fee." The third thing she did was warn me about the judge. Vernon Pike had been on the Barrow County bench for 19 years. Priya said it plainly. She said, "He is not a bad lawyer, and he is not stupid. And he runs his courtroom like a man who has not been told no since the Clinton administration." She said he interrupts. She said he decides in the first 10 minutes and spends the rest of the hearing looking for reasons. She said, "Whatever you do, do not correct him." I asked her if she meant do not argue with him. She said, "No. I mean do not correct him, even when he is wrong about a date, even when he is wrong about your name." The hearing was set for a Tuesday in October. Here's why I was in uniform, and I want to be clear about it because it became the whole hinge of the day, and because a version of this story went around later in which I supposedly wore it to make a point. The night before the hearing, a man named Roy Beckett called me. Roy is the older brother of the corpsman I went into the canal for. Beckett survived that day and lived another 9 years, and then died in a way that had nothing to do with any of it, in a car, on a highway in Ohio, in the rain. Roy calls me every year around the anniversary. That year, the anniversary and the hearing landed in the same week. He told me the family was doing a small dedication at the Veterans Hall Tuesday morning, a plaque, nothing formal, 8 o'clock, and he asked if I would come and stand up front, and I said yes before I did the math. So on Tuesday, I stood in a linoleum hall at 8 in the morning in service dress with about 20 people, and a man read his brother's name off a brass plate, and at 8:40, I got in my car and drove 26 minutes to the courthouse because the hearing was at 9:15, and there was no time to go home and change. That is it. That is the entire sinister reason. Priya saw me come through security, and her face did something complicated. She said, "Oh." I said, "I know." She said, "No, it's fine, it's fine." Then she said, "Just do not let him get under it." The courtroom in Barrow County is small, and it is always full, because the docket runs civil and probate on the same morning, and everybody sits in the same room waiting their turn. There were maybe 50 people in the gallery, 2 women from a title company, a man asleep with his chin on his chest, a young guy with a laptop who I assumed was a law student, and who turned out to be a stringer for the county paper. And in the second to last row, a woman in her 50s in a gray blazer with a legal pad, taking notes. I noticed her. I did not think anything about her. That was a mistake I am glad I made. Tessa and Grant came in at 9:05. Tessa was in navy blue. She had gotten her hair done. Grant would not look at me, and he kept touching the back of his neck, which he has done since he was 9 years old, and lying about something. Their attorney was a man named Dale Kessinger, who does mostly real estate, and who had, I think, absolutely no idea what he had signed up for. Judge Pike came in at 9:19. He is a large man with a voice that fills a room without effort, and the first thing he did was look at his docket, and the second thing he did was look up at me. I watched it happen. I have watched a lot of faces over the years, and I know the difference between a man who was surprised and a man who was annoyed, and Pike was annoyed. He said, "Ma'am, whatever that is on your chest, take it off." Priya was on her feet before I was. She said, "Your Honor, my client is a retired Marine officer, and she has come directly from a memorial service this morning. She had no opportunity to change." Pike did not look at her. He said, "This is a probate matter. It is not Veterans Day. I am not going to have a jury of the public sitting out there deciding this case on the basis of a costume. There is no jury in a probate hearing. Priya told me later that she almost said that out loud and stopped herself, and I am glad she did, because it would have cost us the room. I said, "Your Honor, may I ask that the court's instruction be reflected in the record?" That was the wrong thing to say. I knew it was the wrong thing to say while it was coming out of my mouth. Priya's hand came out toward my arm and did not quite reach me. Pike leaned forward. He said, "Everything in this room is in the record, ma'am. Would you like to be in the record for contempt?" The room got very quiet. Somebody's chair creaked. The man who had been asleep was not asleep anymore. I want to tell you what I felt in that second, because people always assume it was rage. It was not. It was something much older and much more familiar. It was the feeling of standing in front of a senior officer who is wrong, in front of people who are watching, and knowing exactly what the cost of each of your two options is. I have been in that spot before. Every one of us has. And there is a thing they do not teach you in any classroom, which is that sometimes the correct move is to obey the unlawful order in the room and win the war somewhere else. So I said, "No, Your Honor." And then I reached up with my right hand and I took it off. The clasp on the back of a Navy cross is not complicated. It takes about 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. I could hear my own pulse in my ears the way you do at altitude. I unpinned it, and I brought it down, and there was a little pinprick hole in the wool where it had been, and I set it face up on the table in front of me next to a legal pad. Nobody said anything. The court reporter's hands kept moving. Tessa was looking at me. I did not look back at her, but I could feel it, the same way you can feel a hand hovering near your shoulder without touching it. She had wanted a scene. She had planned an entire morning around a scene. She was going to get a woman who had spent 22 years learning how not to give one. And then Judge Pike said the thing that ended his career. He did not know that was what he was doing. That is the part I still think about. He looked at the medal lying on the table, and he looked at me, and he said, "And for the record, ma'am, I have been doing this 19 years, and I have had 6 people stand in that spot in a uniform. 4 of them were lying about it." Priya said, "Your Honor." He kept going. He said, "So let's not use the flag as an exhibit in a family dispute. We'll proceed." I did not move. I want you to understand that I did not move at all. In the second to last row, the woman in the gray blazer stopped writing. She looked up at the bench, and then she looked down. And she wrote for about 15 seconds straight, and by the door, the bailiff, a heavy-set man in his 60s with a white mustache, a man I did not know from Adam, went the color of a brick. His name is Ellis Doty. He did 2 tours in the Gulf. He has stood in that courtroom by that door for 11 years. He did not say a word. He was not allowed to. But I saw his jaw go, and I saw him look at the floor, and I saw the exact moment a man decides that something is going to come out of him eventually, one way or another. The hearing went forward. Here's the thing about a case built on a feeling. It survives right up until somebody makes it hold paper. Kessinger put Tessa on first. She was good for about 6 minutes. She had clearly practiced. She talked about how her mother-in-law had been a warm woman who loved her family, and how that warmth had faded in the last year, and how phone calls had gone unanswered, and how she had felt shut out. Priya let her run. She did not object once. Then she stood up and she was very polite, and she asked 4 questions. She asked Tessa how many times she had visited Ruth Vance in the last 12 months of her life. Tessa said, "I don't have a number for you." Priya said, "More than 10?" Tessa said, "I don't have a number." Priya said, "More than 5?" Tessa said, "I was working." Then Priya asked her to identify a document, and the clerk handed up a printout of Tessa's own text messages, which Kessinger had produced in discovery without, I think, reading them very carefully. There was one from the previous November. It said, "Honestly, the shop is the only thing worth anything down there, and it should be split." There was one from March, the month before Ruth died. It said, "She's not going to last till summer. We need to get ahead of this." Priya read the second one out loud, slowly, and then she said, "No further questions." Kessinger asked for a short recess. Pike denied it. He said, "We're going to keep moving, counselor." That was his second mistake of the morning, and it was a bigger one than it looked, because a recess right then would have let everybody's blood pressure come down. Instead, the whole room stayed at a boil with the temperature climbing. Priya put me on. She walked me through 11 months in about 20 minutes. The medications, the night shifts, the $41,000, line by line, receipt by receipt, with the clerk marking each one. When we got to the roofer, she asked me why my mother had cared about the roof of an empty building. I said, because the electrical panel was under it. She said, and why did she care about that? And I said the true thing, which I had not planned to say. I said because my father wired that panel in 1978 with his own hands, and she was not going to let water get into it. I heard somebody in the gallery breathe out. Pike said, "Let's stay on the finances." Then Priya called the last witness, and this is where the morning turned. Deborah Kettles is a hospice nurse. She had been on Ruth's case for the last 7 months. She is a small woman, maybe 5'1", and she came in wearing scrubs because she had a shift at 11. She testified about my mother's cognitive status, which was documented in her charts, because hospice nurses chart everything. God bless them forever. She testified that Ruth Vance was oriented and decisional on the day the power of attorney was signed, and for months afterward. She testified that in her clinical opinion the patient was not isolated, and that in fact the daughter had repeatedly asked the family to visit more. Then Kessinger, on cross, made the error that ended his client's case. He asked her whether she had any independent knowledge of what Ruth Vance actually wanted done with her property. And Deborah Kettles said, "Yes, sir, I do." There was a voice memo on her phone. She had recorded it in February, at Ruth's request, because Ruth had gotten it into her head that people were going to argue after she was gone, and she wanted something that could not be argued with. Deborah had told her that was not really her job. Ruth had told her to press the button anyway. Deborah pressed the button. It is 1 minute and 51 seconds long. Priya had it. She had had it for 3 weeks. She had held it back on purpose because she wanted it to arrive after Tessa's text messages instead of before. They played it on a phone held up to a microphone, which is the least dignified possible way to hear your dead mother's voice. It is not a dramatic recording. She sounds tired. There is a television going somewhere in the background of it. She says her name and the date. She says that she is of sound mind in exactly those words, because she had heard the phrase on a program and liked it. She says the house is to be sold and split even between her 2 children. Then she says the shop goes to Nora, and she says why, and I am not going to try to reproduce it exactly because I have listened to it maybe 40 times, and I still cannot get through it clean. The short version is that she said Grant hated that building from the time he was 10 years old, and that Nora used to fall asleep in the office chair, and that leaving it to both of them would just mean somebody had to sell it, and she was not going to do that to Walt. At the end she says, "And Tessa, honey, I know. It's all right." That last part is the part that took the wind out of the room. Not the legal part, that part. Tessa put her hand over her mouth. Grant put both hands flat on the table and looked straight down at them and did not lift his head for a long time. The recording ended. Nobody moved. And Judge Pike, who had spent the morning treating this as a nuisance on a crowded docket, sat back in his chair and said, "Well?" Then he said the hearing would be continued to a date to be set, and he stood up, and Ellis Doty said all rise in a voice like a door closing, and it was 11:40 in the morning. I put the Navy Cross in my coat pocket. I did not put it back on. I am not entirely sure why. It felt at that moment like something that would have to be earned back from that room, and the room had not offered. Priya and I walked out into the hallway, and she was shaking a little. "The way you do when the adrenaline finishes with you," she said. That went about as well as it could have gone, and the woman in the gray blazer came up the hallway toward us with her legal pad against her chest. She introduced herself. Her name was Sylvia Reyes. She was a staff investigator for the state commission that handles complaints against judges, and she had been sitting in Vernon Pike's courtroom that morning for a reason that had nothing at all to do with me. There were already complaints. There had been complaints for years, most of them from people with no money and no lawyer, which is exactly why they had never gone anywhere. Her office had opened a review that summer, and part of the process is that somebody sits in the back of the room for a few days and watches. She had picked that Tuesday out of a calendar. That is all. There is no destiny in this story. There is only a woman with an assignment and a man who could not help himself. She asked if I would be willing to give a statement. I said I would think about it. She gave me a card and she said, "Take your time." And then she said one more thing, and it is the only part of the whole day that made my eyes go. She said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, my father had one of those. He kept it in a sock drawer." I thought about it for 4 days. I want to be honest about the 4 days, because this is where people expect me to say that I was full of righteous purpose. I was not. I was tired. I had a case to finish, and a house to empty, and a brother I was not speaking to, and the idea of taking on a sitting judge felt like volunteering for a second job I did not want. What decided it was not my mettle? It was a sentence in Priya's voice from the first week. She had told me that Pike had done something similar in a landlord case 18 months earlier to a woman with no lawyer, and that the woman had walked out and not come back, and had lost by default. That is the thing. I had Priya, I had a shoebox, I had 22 years of learning how to keep my face still while somebody insults me on a bad day. The woman in the landlord case had none of that. She just had Vernon Pike. I gave the statement on a Monday, in an office with bad lighting, and it took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Ellis Doty gave one too. He gave his before I gave mine, actually. He had gone home that Tuesday night and told his wife about it, and she had said, "Ellis, you are going to be sick over this for a year, so call somebody." He called somebody the next morning. He had been a bailiff in that room for 11 years, and he had watched Pike do a version of that to somebody roughly every other month, and he had never said a word about any of it, and he told me later that the thing that finally did it was watching a woman take a medal off her own chest in front of 50 strangers without changing expression. The stringer from the county paper wrote 400 words about the hearing. 400 words in a paper with a circulation somewhere around 9,000. It went up on their website on a Thursday. By Saturday, it was everywhere. I do not fully understand how that happens, and I do not think anybody does. A veterans page picked it up, then a bigger one. By Monday, there were people outside the courthouse who did not live in the county, and a television van from the city, and my phone had 211 messages on it, and I turned it off and drove out to the shop and sat in my father's office chair, with the door locked for most of an afternoon. The formal proceeding took 11 months. I want to be careful here, because the internet version of this story compressed it into a week and made it look like a movie. It was not a week. It was 11 months of documents and hearings, and a lot of very boring administrative language. And it was never really about me. That is the part I most want people to understand. My morning was the thing that made somebody look, but what they found when they looked had nothing to do with a Navy Cross. They found 19 years of a man who had decided the room belonged to him. They found transcripts. They found a woman who had been ordered to take her head covering off in 2016 and who had complied and then never come back to that courthouse for anything again. They found a man in a wheelchair who had been told to stop performing. They found a pattern in how he ruled when the person in front of him did not have counsel. Pike fought it. Of course he did. He hired good lawyers, and he made the argument that a judge has broad discretion over decorum in his own courtroom, and honestly, that argument is not crazy. That is the part people get wrong when they tell this story. He was not wrong that a judge can regulate what people wear. He was wrong that he could do it as an insult, and he was wrong to say what he said after, and he was wrong in about 40 other filings that had nothing to do with a uniform. The commission's findings came out in September of the following year. He was removed from the bench and barred from holding judicial office in the state. There was a separate referral about the bar license that took another year and a half, and that I stopped following. I did not celebrate. I want to say that plainly, because it is the part of this that surprises people. The day I found out, I was at a Lowe's buying a wet vac. My phone buzzed, and it was Priya, and it said one word, "Done," and I stood in an aisle holding a wet vac and felt almost nothing at all. Not triumph. Something closer to the feeling after a long flight when you finally set your bag down. He was 63 years old. He had a wife. Somewhere in that county there is a person who loves him and had to watch all of it happen. I do not think that means he should have kept his job. I think both things are true at once, and anybody who tells you they are not has not lost much of anything themselves. The estate case ended before that, quietly, in December. Kessinger withdrew. Tessa got new counsel who read the file, called Priya, and settled in 9 days. The petition was dismissed with prejudice. The court found the claims were brought without substantial justification and ordered fees. My legal costs came to just under $19,000, and they were paid. Grant came to see me in February. He stood on my porch in a jacket that was not warm enough and did not come inside for the first 10 minutes. When he finally sat down at the kitchen table, he could not get a sentence out for a while, and I let him not get it out, because I have learned that pushing a man through that door does not work. What he eventually said was, "I never read it, Nor." I signed it and I never read it. I said, "I know. He said, "That's worse, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it kind of is." We sat there. That was most of the conversation. He asked about the shop. I told him the roof was fixed. He said, "Dale Rusk?" And I said, "Yes." And he laughed in a way that turned into something else halfway through. Because Dale Rusk had been our father's friend for 40 years and had come to both funerals, and neither of us had said his name out loud in this whole thing until right then. We are all right now. Not the same. All right. He comes down the second Saturday of most months, and we work on things. His youngest, Callie, is 15 and comes with him sometimes and is better on the lathe already than her father ever was, which I mention to Grant approximately every time. Tessa and Grant separated that spring, and the divorce was final the year after. I am not going to pretend I fought it. I am also not going to pretend I feel good about it, because 2 kids came out of that marriage, and neither of them did anything to anybody. I saw her once, about a year ago, at a gas station off the highway. She was pumping gas, and I was inside paying for coffee, and we saw each other through the glass. She looked at me for about 2 seconds, and then she looked at the pump. I did not go out and say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have been for my benefit instead of hers. I hope she is all right. I mean that in the plainest, least generous way possible. I hope she is all right, and I hope she is far away from anything of mine. The shop is open again, not as a business. I could not run a job shop at a profit if you gave me a year in a loan. It is open on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and most of Saturday, and there are usually somewhere between 4 and 11 people in it, and almost all of them are veterans, and a few of them are just neighbors who wanted to learn how to fix a chair. There are no dues. There is a coffee can by the door and a hand-painted sign that says, "Put in what you can," which my father would have found hilarious, because it is exactly how he ran his accounts receivable for 31 years. Ellis Doty comes on Thursdays. He retired from the courthouse the same year all this ended, which he says had nothing to do with any of it, and which I do not entirely believe. He is very good with wood and very bad with metal, and he has broken 2 of my taps and paid for 4. The first Thursday he came, before he ever picked up a tool, he asked if he could see it. I got the walnut box out of the office drawer and opened it on the workbench, and he looked at it for a good long while without touching it. Then he asked me a question that nobody had asked me in the entire 11 months, through all the hearings and all the phone calls and all the strangers on the internet. He asked what the corpsman's name was. Nobody had asked me that, not one person. They had asked about the judge and the medal and my sister-in-law and the money, and not one of them had asked me the only thing about that day that ever actually mattered. I told him. Beckett. Ronald Beckett, from Zanesville, Ohio, who could not swim. Ellis nodded and said the name back once, the way you do, and then he closed the box and handed it to me and asked where the drill bits were. The medal lives in the drawer. Same drawer. It is not on a wall, and it is not in a shadow box, and I have turned down 4 requests to display it at events, politely and 1 impolitely. I have worn it exactly 5 times now. The 5th was at the dedication of the plaque for Beckett, 2 years after the hearing, when they finally got the permanent one made. People ask me if I regret taking it off in that courtroom. They ask it a lot. I think they want me to say that it was the hardest thing I ever did, and it was not by a distance you could measure with a map. Here is what I actually think. That morning, one of us in that room believed the medal was the point. He looked at it and saw a costume and a claim and a thing he could take away, and when he took it away, he thought something had happened. Nothing happened. It was 4 seconds and a pin. What he could not touch was a canal in another country, and a man named Beckett, and the 11 months I slept with the door open, listening for my mother to call out. That is not on a coat. You cannot order it off somebody. It was in the room the entire time, and he did not know it, and he lost his whole life's work standing 8 feet away from it. I did not beat him. I want to be clear about that. A hospice nurse with a voice memo, a bailiff with a conscience, an investigator who happened to pick a Tuesday, and a woman in 2016 who took her head covering off and never came back. They beat him. I just happened to be standing there when it started. The shop is open Saturday. The roof is good. My father's calendar is still on the wall, still turned to the wrong month, and I am never taking it down. If this one got to you, tell me where you are watching from tonight. I read them. And if you want the next one, you know what to do.